So when I first started out painting, my paintings never felt like they had enough depth in them. They never felt like they had vast, expansive atmospheres, and they never felt as if they were spacious or that they had any room to breathe. Oftentimes, what would happen is the elements would get clustered together, and there would be a difficulty to find depth or space between foreground, midground, and background. And those three elements, foreground, midground, and background, are extremely important to differentiate in certain scenes. We want to have a clear foreground, midground, and background. Now, sometimes we do want to have a scene that is heavily atmospheric, where we can't see much of the background, or where the midground may transition into the foreground. But for the most part, we usually do want to have a clear idea, or at least indication of foreground, midground, and background. So how can we distinguish certain elements from being closer to us or further back from us in the scene? Understanding this is a key principle in understanding how to convey depth, how to convey spaciousness, and ultimately how to convey a sense of realism. Although all these tips on their own will help, it's when you combine them together that they work to create something that really conveys spaciousness and depth. The first idea here would be scale. Scale is, in basic terms, how large or how small something is within a scene. Scale is important because when objects are further away from us in a scene, they get smaller. Anything further away from you is going to be smaller than if that same object was closer to you. So for example, if we have two identical trees in a scene, if one tree is smaller, then it would be further back in the scene. Now, if you just shrink the tree and you don't include any of these other tips that I'll talk about in this video, and if you don't take into account perspective, then the tree might not come across as being further back, but it might just look like a mini tree. So it's important not to stop here. After all, scale is just one of the few things we can do. And so the next element or idea here would be color. So I'm gonna break this one down into three separate parts under the umbrella of color. So we have saturation, we have hue, and we have value. Those are the three elements that create any color. We'll start with saturation. Usually the further something is in a scene, the less saturated it tends to be compared to elements that are closer to us in a scene. This is in a large part due to atmospheric perspective. So basically, atmospheric perspective is all these particles of atmosphere between the viewer's eye and the object in a scene. All those particles get denser and denser the further back away we go from an object, because there's more space between us and the object. And so what happens is the further away we go, those particles start to desaturate the object because less of the object's true local color can be seen. And so the object also starts to look more like whatever the atmosphere color is, whether it be a blue atmosphere on a blue sky day or a yellow-orange atmosphere on a sunset. This is the hue of the color changing. So what that means is if something is further back in the scene on a blue sky day, that object will be more shifted towards the blues so that the object will appear as if it's blue. It could be a green hill that will actually, if it's far back enough, look like a blue hill. Likewise, if it's in a sunset scene, the hill would be a much warmer orange hue instead. The third element here is value. And this is the most important of the three because value is how light or how dark the object is and ultimately how readable it is. So things that are further back in space, farther away from us, are more often than not lighter than when they are closer to us. Now, this isn't true 100% of the time. There are cases where the background has shadows and the foreground is very well lit. Or maybe the local value of an object in the background is just naturally darker. But more often than not, things as they recede back into distance get lighter than if they were closer to us. So keep those things in mind. Things usually become less saturated, shift hues or color temperatures, and become lighter the further back they are. So we now have this idea combined with the fact that objects get smaller with depth. We can now go to the third idea, which would be detail. When painting and even in real life, our eyes can't pick up intricate details at a very far distance. So what happens is we start to blur and group details and colors together. What we get is a simplified version of the real object. So our brains simplify these things. As they're further away, we block out the noise because we simply can't see them with our own eyes. So when painting, we want to reflect that. We want to reflect the same idea that happens in real life. And so what we do is, instead of sitting here and drawing out, painting out every single detail of an object that's in a very far background, what we can do is simplify. So we'll simplify shapes, edges, and details, and even colors. And we'll group those things as well to help reduce some of the noise and some of that complexity. The next idea would be overlap. Overlap is a good way to convey depth when combined with these other previous elements that we talked about, because overlap is allowing us to show one element in front of another and clearly indicate which one is closer and which one is further. So if we have a foreground element that overlaps a background element, and we have a clear indication of value, of scale, and of detail density, it then becomes very clear what's closer to us and what's further away from us. If you have everything on the same level and nothing ever overlaps, then that's one of the fastest ways to flatten your painting. So overlap will help us differentiate different parts of the painting, different elements, and different levels of depth. It's almost a subconscious way to show us what comes next in terms of depth in the scene, since we're so used to seeing it on a daily basis. Finally, we have effects, and effects can be anything. So effects could be lighting, they could be atmosphere, fog, smoke, or any number of other things like that. Adding effects would usually be some more extra or final adjustments to push your depth over the top. If you still feel like you need a little bit more depth or space in between two objects, then what I would usually do is go in and add some effects like lighting, fog, smoke, or atmosphere, or anything like that, just to push those two pieces further apart. And one final thing, if you don't have an understanding of perspective, then you only get so far. So perspective is going to be very important when it comes to making your paintings. It's too big of a topic to cover in today's video, but I'll be making more videos in the future about perspective and about things of that nature. So stick around for that. And so remember, scale, color, detail, overlap, and effects. It's when we use all these together that we can then start to see a scene have more space, openness, and ultimately have more depth. So hopefully this video was helpful. Hopefully you were able to learn something from it. If you want to support me or my work on Patreon, I'll leave a link in the description. There's free brushes, PSD files, and other stuff on there. Either way, I appreciate the support. And as always, stay creative.